What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we are prepping the Z for a wrap. That's right, this thing is getting wrapped. I'm super excited to announce that I have partnered up with my buddy Logan over at Defined Wraps and Everprint Graphics in Colton, California. I'll put his info down in the bio. He's gonna help me out and get this thing wrapped, as well as get a sick livery put on this thing. I am so excited. But before we get into that, we do have some work to do on the Z. This thing has some dings, some dents, some scratches that I have to fix before we can head down there and get this thing wrapped. So let's dive into the prep work. I actually started this a few days ago, so I'm gonna rewind you guys to when I started on this, and that will get you up to speed to where we're at now. All right, so since we're in the process of doing this prep work for the wrap, and it does involve doing some body work, getting some of the little dents and dings out and stuff, one thing I wanted to do was shave the antenna. Let me show you guys how I'm gonna do that. So I want to show you guys how this comes apart first. This top ring, I already took it apart. This top ring just unscrews. You can see it's got little like holes in it that you can put those snap ring pliers in or anything like that and just rotate it. That comes out, then this piece lifts off, and then we'll go into the trunk. Hopefully you can see that. You unbolt, there's a 10 mil here, unhook this wire, and then this should just pull on down, and then we'll be left without an antenna. Let me get that out, and then I'll show you how to actually patch that up so it looks like it was never there. So there are a few different ways to start the prep of this. Obviously I removed the tail light just so it's out of the way. I'm just gonna use 80 grit on a sanding block just to kind of knock that down. I'm also gonna do the same on the dent there. You can kind of see that little ding. Of course, you could do this with a grinder as well. You just want to be careful of how much material you're taking off. If you're digging in with the grinder, you could definitely make this metal a lot thinner than it already is, which is gonna make it way harder to weld. And ultimately, that's what we're gonna be doing, is welding a little plug in where that hole is. So I'm just gonna hand sand it. I think that's the safest way to do it. Just like that, it's all sanded up. You can see I kind of focused the sandpaper right around where the antenna hole was, and then just feathered it out with the 80. So from here, we'll just have to make a little plug out of metal and then weld it in. Well, there's no going back now. I'm sure you saw in that B-roll, I did a bit more sanding than I initially anticipated. The main reason for that was just to highlight the areas that do need body work. Like I said, the little ding on the quarter panel, had a ding on the door from when I slammed into those tires at Adams a while back. So we sanded that out. That was that random ding. Obviously we're gonna shave that. This was a big scratch down the quarter panel. It had actually gone down to the metal, so that's why you see it sanded there. That was another random scratch, and you can actually tell that's a dent. So a good way to look for a dent here is you see this is bare metal, this is bare metal, this is still unsanded paint. So that means this is a low spot here. So you could pull this out if you were a super fancy professional and didn't want any filler on your car. I'm just gonna sand it and fill it. It's not that big of a dent. That filler will definitely take care of that. Same story on the door here. That's just a little door ding. But again, you can tell it's sanded all around it, and it's not sanded in the middle. So that's how we know it's a low spot. That's why we're using a sanding block and not just our hands. So now we know what we're kind of getting into here as far as all the bodywork goes. Really not that bad. This car is pretty straight. So the first thing I want to tackle is shaving this little antenna hole. So on those previous clips, I sanded it down. It is bare metal here. So I'm just gonna get a small piece of sheet metal cut to plug that hole, and then we'll weld it in place. All right, so we got a little metal plug cut out. Pretty happy with how that fits. You can see there's almost no gap anywhere. I've got it held in with a magnet right now, and it's laying really flush with that. So all that's left now is just to weld it in. If you're doing something like this at home, keep in mind you want access to the back of the panel. So my trunk obviously is always gutted, but so that's the back of where we're gonna weld. The reason you want access to that is because there are gonna be sparks coming in, things like that. You are at risk for starting a fire. So keep some water handy, make sure you have access to the back of the panel, and you should be good. Another tip when it comes to setting up the welder, make sure it's turned down. I have mine turned down to the lowest setting. You don't wanna burn this thing in super hot and warp the metal, This is just a tiny little thing we're doing, so the risk of warping it's pretty low, but if you're doing something a bit bigger or working on some thinner metal, there's definitely a risk of warping it if you introduce too much heat into the panel, so do be careful there. Little bit of welding, little bit of grinding later, and it is done. You kind of can't tell, but there is the tiniest little bit of warping in this panel. The very top portion got a little hotter than I wanted it to, but really you can't see it. I don't think it's going to be much of anything. You can kind of tell from that angle. There's like a little dip there. I mean, I was planning on using some filler anyways, so it's going to be fine, but I just thought it was funny that I just filmed that clip saying, don't put too much heat in it, it'll warp the panel. And then I immediately did it. But thankfully it's very, very minor and it's not gonna take much filler to fix that. So just like we did with the hood, I just hit the quarter panel with 180 on the DA to sand out all the 80 grit scratches. Next step from here is gonna be putting some filler on where we shave the antenna hole. There's a little door ding on the quarter there. This was just a scratch I feathered out, so we can leave that. And then there's another door ding here. It's kind of hard to see, but so we'll put some filler on these 3 spots, and then the quarter should be one step closer to being good. Some advice if you're tackling something like this, where I'm doing bodywork on the entire car, just move one panel at a time. It's way easier to kind of keep track of progress that way and not get overwhelmed by having to do the entire car. Unless you're like a pro or somebody who works really fast and has a bunch of nice tools. Maybe you could work faster than I can, but for me at least, it's easier just to do one panel at a time. So I'm gonna slap some filler on this quarter and then we'll keep moving towards that. So unfortunately, my really nice filler dried up. Makes sense, it's about 10 years old. So we are using this Bondo brand filler. This is a $12 can from AutoZone and it came with the tiniest little thing of hardener ever. This is gonna work just fine. You don't need super fancy stuff. Now, we don't need a lot of filler because we are doing some pretty small areas. So I'm just gonna toss a bit on there. Now, when it comes to the hardener, I don't know what the exact ratio is or anything like that. I've always just been taught a little stripe. And that's about all you need. So you can see, I would say it's maybe 10% hardener compared to the rest. That's actually a bit more, but it's kind of cold here today. So the more hardener you put in, the faster it'll dry. Don't put too much because it'll literally dry on your board. And then it's just a matter of mixing it in. Everybody has their own way of mixing this stuff. This is what I like to do. Just kind of stir it up there until you get a nice, even, consistent color. You can see how it's starting to turn that light blue. Getting rid of those little streaks in there. I would say that looks good. Now we can put it on the panel. So when it comes to putting Bondo on the panel, you want to really use your spreader. I would say at first just kind of do a light coat. I'm hardly putting any pressure on it because you really want to work the filler into those dents. And then once you have a coat like that, you can use your spreader and put a bit more pressure and really try to kind of flatten it out. Like I said, pressing it into those dents there. The nicer you lay this on, the less sanding you'll have to do. So take your time, try to smooth it out. I would say that looks pretty good there. You can move on to this other little dent down here. While the Bondo's still kind of pliable, you can scrape it off your board like that. So now I have way less cleaning to do. You can see there are some spots I didn't do that, and that's why this board's messy. But again, this thing's like 10 years old. So same thing with the scraper. I will just scrape this off while it's still kind of soft. If you wait for it to dry, it's a lot harder to get off. All right, now we just give it maybe 10, 15 minutes to dry, and then we can sand these spots down and see how they look. Something worth mentioning, on the little spot that we welded in that plug for the antenna hole, I'm gonna primer the back side of it. Anytime you weld anything, obviously you're burning off any of the paint, primer, stuff like that. on both sides of the panel. So the inside of it could get some rust on it at some point. Now, while the quarter panel of this car may end up smashed 6 months or a year from now, I'd still rather just dust a bit of primer on the inside just for the peace of mind. So if we look in there, you can see where I welded that. I just kind of hit it with a little wire brush, and now I'm just gonna dust some primer in there. That way I know it's protected. For primer, we're going back to SEM products, just like we did on the KBD bumper, but this time we have the self-etching primer, which is what I'm using on any of the bare metal stuff. And then the high build primer surfacer, which will go over the Bondo and any places that we do body work, so we can make sure that all the little scratches and stuff are filled in nicely. I've talked about SEM products before and why I like them and why I use them. I picked these ones up on Amazon because it seems to be the cheapest I could find online. I'm gonna put a link down below. Like I had mentioned in previous videos, if you guys are interested in any of the products that I talk about on here that I get on Amazon, if you buy them through my link, it helps support the channel, it helps support me. I definitely appreciate that. So if you need some primer, click that link. SEM is the way to go. All right, so we started with our self-etching primer on the bare metal, really just focused around the filler. There was bare metal there, some bare metal there, and just a bit on the door. Like I said, the self-etching primer is gonna prevent rust. So we're gonna let that flash off for a few minutes and then cover the whole area with a high build primer. Now, if you're using self-etching primer, it's important that you put high build primer or some other kind of primer on top of it. And if you are gonna do that, you wanna do it quick. You're just gonna let this flash off and then put the other primer right on top. If you wait for a little while, you're gonna have to sand it back down and then put the primer back on top. There's like a weird window that you kind of have to be in. At least that's what I've always been taught. So that's what I'm gonna do. Like I said, next we're gonna put the high build primer on. We'll probably do a couple coats just to fill in any of the smaller imperfections in the filler. All right, here's where we're finishing off for the night. Primer is all dry. This turned out great. You can't see where that antenna was or where that dent was or where this dent was. I went ahead and primered a little bit on the door because there was some chips right there. I need to hit that spot a bit later, and I started sanding over here as well. And we have some issues to fix over there, but overall it's coming along pretty well. I think this quarter panel was the bulk of the issues on this side of the car. Just have to kind of prep that fender. It's got a few little issues in the paint that I need to feather out. And then I think we're gonna be good. Like I said, I'm really happy with how this turned out. Bodywork looks really good. It looks so much better without that goofy antenna there. All right, so I'm not gonna bore you guys with a bunch of clips of doing the same kind of bodywork over and over again. Hopefully you got a good idea of what to do just based off what I did on that corner panel, because that pretty much covers anything you'd run into when it comes to like basic entry-level bodywork stuff. The only other thing I do want to touch on is I'm gonna try to fix my rear bumper. If you remember from the Utah trip, actually I don't know if I filmed it, but the bumper started to split and was like flapping in the wind on one corner. Let me show you the issue we have. So this is where it bolts to the car, and then this is the part that was flapping in the wind. So you can see how it split like pretty far down there, and then I drilled some holes in it for zip ties. So I'm gonna attempt to plastic weld this thing back together. Now, I've never really used a plastic welder. I just picked one up at Harbor Freight and I'm gonna give it a shot. And I figured I'd bring you guys along for the ride. All right, so I cleaned the area just with some acetone, and then I put some tape on it to try to get this crack to close up. I only put a little bit of tape because I don't want it to interfere with what I'm gonna attempt to plastic weld, which is this kind of corner here. Now, this kit also came with this cool mesh stuff. So I just cut a little bit, I bent it at a 45, and I'm thinking I'll just kind of place it in here and then like melt the plastic to it, and hopefully that will do something. Not really sure. Okay, so I'm just gonna start with this plastic filler rod and not the metal, just to kind of see what happens here. So I'm gonna start by filling in one of these holes. I think it's gonna be maybe the easiest. Again, I'm not totally sure what I'm doing here. Okay, it's starting to melt. It smells terrible. It's definitely a little slower than I thought, but I think that's a good thing. I think it's gonna make it pretty easy to control. Okay, I think this is gonna work. I'm just kind of like working this melted plastic into this corner here. And I think now that it's soft, I'm gonna try to get this little metal piece kind of jammed in here, and hopefully that plastic will hold it. Yeah, we're getting somewhere. So I'm using this welder to kind of work this metal piece into the like corner here, and then I'm just going to melt the plastic filler into the corner in hopes that it will hold it in and kind of hold this whole thing together. Okay, this is working, but it's definitely a slow process. I'm gonna throw you guys on a time lapse and then I'll kind of talk you through how I made it work when it's done. All right, so I kind of changed my technique up about halfway through. This is what I'm starting to do now. So I laid the little mesh metal in there, and then I actually started melting it into the bumper without using any of the filler. That way I know it's anchored into the bumper, and then I'll just fill in the middle section, which is where the crack was. So I came back to this one that I had put a bunch of filler in and made sure to melt the mesh into the bumper rather than just having it attached to the filler. And I think that's gonna create a much stronger bond. It looks a little ugly on this side, but on the other side, I think it's gonna turn out really well. So you can see I kind of patched up those holes there. And then I just started melting the crack together without really any filler. And I'm just gonna kind of continue that down, and I should be able to just sand that out when I'm done and have it look decent, I hope. After a bit of sanding, this is what we're left with. Looks really good. There's some imperfections there. Most of this smoothed out good, but you can see there's a tiny bit of imperfections there and there, just because you can't get a perfectly smooth result with the plastic welder. And then those were the holes that I drilled for the zip ties. So from here, I'm just gonna put a little bit of filler on the imperfections and just kind of smooth it out. Now it's tempting to want to put filler over the whole thing and like really make this perfect, but you do have to remember, if you're using filler like Bondo or something along those lines, it's not very flexible. So you don't want to put a lot on something as flexible as a plastic bumper. They do make flexible fillers for bumpers specifically, but I don't have any. And at the end of the day, this is a drift car, and the rear bumper is probably the first thing that's gonna get totally ruined. That's why we're in this predicament in the first place. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of filler over those ugly spots. That way I can smooth those out and it should look totally fine. Just tossed the bumper on and pulled the car out front. Take a look at how good this looks. Super happy with how it turned out. So obviously I still have some body work to do on the rest of the car, but like I said, I didn't want to bore you guys by shooting a bunch of clips of the same stuff. So hopefully you got an idea, some tips and tricks to do if you're doing your own body work at home. I hope you guys are as excited as I am to see this thing wrapped. I cannot wait. I'm so hyped and so thankful to be working with Logan over at Everprint Graphics and Define Wraps. That's gonna be a sick video or two when we actually make it down there and he shows us what it takes to wrap something like this. So like I said, super happy, super excited. That's gonna be so rad, and I'm so excited to have this thing looking cool for Drift Week. It's gonna be a whole different car, and that's gonna be the craziest experience ever. Anyways, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and as always, I will catch you in the next one.